All right, guys, in this video, I'm going to talk about Chapter 10, Labor Unions and Collective Bargaining. The emergence of unions goes back to the post-industrial revolution period. Prior to this, pre-industrial revolution, you had mostly self-employed workers that wouldn't coalesce into unions. But during and after the Industrial Revolution, you start to see this separation of management from labor. Remember, self-employed workers, management and labor are the same thing because you're working for yourself. But with the Industrial Revolution, the managers are part of the company and the labor is another part. And they have to come to some sort of agreement as to what the wage and compensation package is going to be. Workers during the industrial period were kind of at a disadvantage because you had these very large monopsonistic kind of employers, meaning that they were in many cases the sole buyers of labor that could push wages down to the detriment of workers. So workers started to counter that monopsony power with monopoly power by coalescing on the supply side of the labor market and collectively bargaining. Workers became dependent on the capital owners for employment and united to protect their interest and bargain collectively with employers. For the U.S., this took place in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a period known as the Progressive Movement. A lot of influence politically for workers came out of this period. And then they got even more traction during FDR's reign in the Great Depression period. Let's look at some of the stats. This is 2011 data, but the patterns will be similar today. Notice that union membership by industry is low in finance and insurance, low in trade and mining, much higher in government, public administration, or transportation and warehousing, construction, even manufacturing. We're going to see that unionization tends to be dominant in goods producing industries, in capital intensive industries, and in the public sector. Down here it shows union membership by occupation. So construction, professional, and something else there, transportation, installation and repair, production, higher levels of unionization. So we're going to see that unions dominate with blue collar workers, tend to be more attractive to lower wage, not extremely low wage. Extremely low wage workers generally don't like unions because they have to pay the union dues, and oftentimes the lowest paying jobs are transitory, so people aren't in them long enough to really benefit from a union. But lower wage, meaning lower than maybe the median. And then non-supervisory workers. It's very rare to see unionization in occupations that are management. Also notice that we see public unionization as a much higher percentage than private. So this shows that 36% of public sector workers, government workers, are unionized, where only maybe 7 or 8% of private sector workers are unionized. This legislative shift towards more government unionization occurred in the 60s and the 70s. And the theory here is that there was pent-up demand for unionization and the government didn't resist. I mean, it's almost like you had for decades, starting with the early 20th century, you had all this unionization occurring in private industry. And the government was laying a platform for that private sector unionization to occur. So by the time we got to the 60s and the 70s, people started to say, well, why shouldn't the public sector be unionized? And the public sector was supportive of unions, so there was little resistance. Today, it's pretty clear that if you work for the public sector, your odds of being unionized are much higher than if you work for the private sector. Look at the demographics. So union membership by group. Women and youth tend to be less represented by unions. You can see that here. Women here are at about, what is that, maybe 12%, whereas men are higher. Men are more likely to be unionized. And then younger people are less likely to be unionized. Under 25, you're looking at around 4% union, whereas 25 and over, all the way up here to 13 or so percent. And the theory is that women and youth are more likely to work in industries that aren't as union oriented, service industries. And the other thing is that younger people and women may be less attached to the labor force for maybe different reasons, but that decreased attachment means there's less incentive to unionize. Unions are attractive to people that are going to be in a job for a long period of time, not moving in and out of positions. And for young people, it's natural to move in and out of positions because of school and just because of gaining experience and moving into higher levels. And for women, traditionally, it's because of family and child bearing, this entry and exit from the labor market. And then African Americans are much more likely to be unionized. One of the highest union groups of all here at 14 or so percent. And the theory with African Americans is that they're more likely to work in the goods producing industries. Think of manufacturing, like the automobile industry, very heavily African American, and that's one of the most unionized industries in the country. Okay, so you get a little bit of demographic sense there. Also note that union membership varies by state. Some states tend to be more embracive of unions, others less. Generally speaking, the southern states have much lower union membership, all the way down here to maybe 3 to 5% of the labor force, versus the northern states or the western states like Connecticut, Illinois, California, Oregon. Hawaii is kind of an outlier there. Alaska, a bit of an outlier. But these states have much higher unionization. Could be many reasons. Could be different industries. The South tends to be more blue collar, whereas many of these states tend to be more white collar. These states tend to be more good producing, right? Whereas these states tend to be more service producing. But it could also be political. Some states set up support for unionization that is going to create more unions than other states. California and New York, for example, are fairly liberal states politically, and liberal states tend to embrace unions more than more conservative states like, say, Texas or Louisiana. Union membership has changed over time. Going back to 1880, you'll notice it's very low in the US as a percentage of union members. It's fluctuated, but generally speaking, there was an upward trajectory until the 50s. Peak rates were in the 50s at almost a third of the entire labor force. That's not the peak membership, though. That's the peak rates. It's probably the best stat to use, the percentage of the labor force. But the actual membership was highest in the 1980s at around 20 million. That's fallen ever since. The peak rates in the 1950s, though, have fallen precipitously to today, where we're around 9, 10, 11% of the labor force. And we want to understand why this decline has occurred. One explanation is called the structural change hypothesis. This just says that employment has shifted towards white-collar service, women, small firms, part-time in southern states. All of these things are not compatible with unionization. Another factor is import competition in the U.S. has increased. As we've opened up the trade with the rest of the world, that has lowered prices and made it more difficult for domestic companies to compete internationally. Adding a union to that would only make them less competitive, because remember, unions are going to drive up wages. Now, that's going to benefit the workers that retain their job, but that's going to make the company less competitive as they try to raise prices to compensate for those higher wages. So import competition has definitely influenced the desirability of unionization in the U.S. And successive union workers have incentivized firms to relocate to non-union areas and substitute capital for labor. Interestingly, unions, to the extent they've been effective, it's had the unintended consequence of many companies have went to areas where unions are less effective. They've relocated to those southern states. They've relocated to other countries in some cases where the probability of being unionized is lower. They've also moved from capital or from labor to capital. Makes sense, right? Capital doesn't unionize. Capital doesn't collectively bargain for higher wages. So capital, to the extent you can substitute it, may be a better alternative for the firm than labor. We call this a structural change hypothesis because all of these things have to do with structural changes in the economy. The economy is changing, allowing for companies to produce with less union potential. Another explanation for the decline in unionism is the managerial opposition hypothesis. It says that firms will use various mechanisms to counter unionization. One method is to suggest to the workers that if they unionize, they're creating an adversarial relationship that's ultimately going to be detrimental to the worker. Kind of scare them, make the worker think that unionization will come back to bite them. Maybe the firm would hire strike breakers to replace striking workers. The strike is the ammunition that the union has to get those higher wages. The threat that all workers would walk out on the job, leaving the firm with no one to produce with, is a powerful tool for getting higher wages. But the firm could always hire other labor. As those workers go out and are picketing and not working, then why not just hire other workers? These are called strike breakers that would substitute for the union or unionizing workers. Another one is to delay the National Labor Relations Board union certification. When a union wants to form, they submit an application to the National Labor Relations Board, a government agency that will either approve or disapprove the petition to unionize. If they approve it, then they would then administer a vote in the firm to see if everybody in the firm or a majority of people in the firm are interested in unionizing. So one thing that the firm can do is they could delay that union certification, because oftentimes the unionization process is an emotional one. You rally the workers, you get them excited about collectively bargaining, pushing up those wages, and taking on the owner of the company, the big business. But the longer you can delay certification, the longer that the time goes by for that emotion to subside and for people to start to calm down and maybe not have the same enthusiasm. The other thing is to hire labor management consultants to mount anti-union drives. Companies will go out and they'll actually employ these consultants to try to strategically prevent unionization. And finally, dismiss pro-union workers. Now, this would be illegal. Wagner Act of 1935 made this illegal, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's like speeding on the freeway, right? I mean, you can make something illegal, people still do it. Firms, especially small firms, might be able to get away with that. Find some justification for getting rid of those people that would try to initiate a unionization among the workers. All right, so managerial opposition. And then finally, the substitution hypothesis. This says that government has actually come to do what the unions used to do. Remember, prior to the Great Depression, we didn't have Social Security. We didn't really have OSHA, health and safety laws. This is the Occupational Safety and Hazards Administration. We didn't have national unemployment insurance or workers' compensation. A lot of these programs came about as a result of the malaise from the Great Depression. But we do have these now. Government is kind of acting like a union would have in the past. And so what unions used to do, government is doing, which means maybe you don't need unions as much as you used to. The other thing is that firms counter potential unionization by providing job amenities on their own. So the government's doing a lot, but unions, in recognition that, firms, in recognition that unions could pose a problem for them, they try to prevent them. And they do things like providing a two-way communication channel, right? A human resources department, for example, is just a way to give employees redress for any concerns they have within the firm. And that's something unions typically would provide, right? If you had a problem with the business, you could go to the union and they would provide you some sort of redress. Well, now the firm does that themselves. Addressing workers' grievances, kind of similar to that within the firm. Seniority protection. Right? A lot of firms offer not only protection as you stay with the firm longer, but also sometimes pensions and other fringe benefits the longer you stay with the company. So unions today may not have the same value they did, 100 years ago, because the firm has provided a lot of the things unions would negotiate for, or the government has. All right, that's it. We'll pick up in the next video. Thanks.